Before we start this special edition of the podcast, I just wanted to extend my thanks to Lloyd's Register for sponsoring this year's edition of the Lloyd's List Outlook Forum. Thank you, Ella. The volume and frequency of sanctions being targeted against shipping has never been higher or more visible. Sanctions are now a daily part of the Lloyd's List news agenda, so it's sometimes difficult to see how far and how fast things are really changing. But the risk and compliance landscape has noticeably changed this year. We're seeing more targeted sanctions, and in response, we're seeing an ever-evolving shift of circumvention tactics from an ever-growing dark fleet that is looking more and more dangerous by the day. And the politics are also shifting. Much of Donald Trump's sanctions strategy remains, as we record this, unclear and on past experience unpredictable. It's a fair bet that Tehran can expect to be under more pressure after January the 20th next year. But what happens to Russia? That's the big question. And what does that mean for the rest of shipping that's been left to navigate its way around not just increasingly hefty compliance burden, but what is essentially a tiered trading system, where one part of the industry is jumping through hoops to apply regulation and decarbonize and pay for carbon burned, while another section sails without basic adherence to safety regulations, no insurance, no legitimate flag even. They are outside of the rules-based order of shipping, and they are earning a premium for it. So when Lloyd's List hosted its annual Outlook Forum in London earlier this month, this was the context to our discussion around sanctions risk and compliance. And I should point out at this point, if you had not listened to the previous edition of this podcast, where we brought you highlights from the first panel from our Outlook event, now would be a good time to hit pause and go back and listen to that bit first. For the rest of you, though, this is the second and final part of our edited highlight series that you're going to be listening to today. On the panel were Michelle Lindemann, a sanctions specialist and partner at Van Bael & Bellis, and Daniel Martin, another leading figure in the legal world specializing in shipping sanctions risk and compliance. He hails from HFW, where he is a partner. And of course, you will be hearing from our resident risk and compliance leading lights, Michelle Wiese-Bockmann and Bridget Dyken.
Well, thank you. Welcome back for the second session. I'm glad, actually, the majority of you stuck around. I'm very pleased. Thank you. As I said in the first one, we wanted to separate this out because there is too much detail in what we are looking at around risk and compliance. And I think it is incumbent on us all to actually look at what is happening, because there are huge implications here for everybody. And as we've alluded to in the first panel, a lot of this is not just about rule breaking. This is about the fundamental safety of the industry. But there's also the risk aspect for you, the good guys out there. How diligent does due diligence need to be in order to uncover dodgy dealings and suspicious sanctions evasion? The answer, billable at a fairly hefty hourly rate from some of the world's leading sanctions lawyers on our panel, is that it depends. Are you genuinely looking for transparency, or are you seeking plausible deniability should anyone come asking once something shady has come to light after the fact? We've seen this alignment of EU, UK and US. It's changed significantly because we're now targeting specific ships. So I guess the basic question is, are the sanctions having more of an impact than last year?
Well, yes, they are, and that's because there are more of them.
Regular podcast listeners will, of course, recognise the dulcet tones of Michelle Wiese-Bockmann there from Lloyd's List Intelligence.
But we're also seeing a different approach. So we've got the US, which I would characterise as a sledgehammer approach. They're just sanctioning anything and everything that they think is associated with their aims. And then we've got the UK, which has been more constant, recognised that the vessels are sanctioned, they're still trading. But they've now started targeting ships as they go through the English Channel and asking about their insurance. They're finding out the insurance and then they're sanctioning them, which is how they sanctioned the last two insurers that came through. The EU, I think the jury's out about how effective their sanctions are, but certainly the strategic element that we're seeing from the UK, that they're able to secure agreements from Panama, and they've had words with Gabon and Cameroon, and I believe they've also had words with Barbados now. And these have been the fastest growing registries that have sort of developed new business off the back of the dark fleet. So I think it's really very much a watch this space, and I see a further crackdown, and I see sanctions getting stickier. Yes, they're going to marginalise those tankers, but instead of being grey areas, we're now going to have flashing red light dangerous areas. And we're going to clearly know that ship, what its purpose is, and that it's a dangerous piece of floating steel and an accident waiting to happen. And I think that's what the sanctions are doing now, is they're highlighting that.
I think the narrow question of have sanctions been effective, I think they've been effective in two ways. They've caused the industry to change in terms of the amount of diligence we do, the scrutiny that we attach to transactions, and that's a good thing. But the other thing they've been effective in doing, I think, is splitting us into two separate bodies of trade. We have a very strong parallel fleet.
That was Daniel Martin, partner at HFW there.
And I think the nature of that will need to be grappled with over the next 12 months is how do we deal with the fact that, yes, the sanctions are effective in causing a certain cohort of players to change their behaviour, but really what it does is create an opportunity for another group with whom we've got less close jurisdictional or legal ties, and therefore it's much more difficult to change their behaviours. So I think that's an interesting change. I think the other thing that we've seen is the nature of queries we've been getting are quite different. I mean, it's difficult to speak from here because we see inevitably a small subset of those who are seeking to be compliant. And the bad guys don't talk to us any more than they listen to you. But I think I feel that where we've got to is the level of overlapping restrictions from EU, UK, US, even if you look within just the UK regulations, the complexity that we're sitting in with those regulations is now so great, and it's so much greater than anything we've seen before, that when we started doing this work back in 22, the work was interesting, but it was a question of reading the regulation and understanding it. Now I suspect Michelle's right, you're flicking through 100 plus pages of regulation, 100 plus pages of FAQs, and I think that where that's led people to is that the challenge of managing this issue is so great and so difficult that it's almost easier just not to do it. I almost feel like we're getting to the point where a US model in which everything is prohibited unless permitted would be easier to navigate than where we've ended up. And we're also seeing the courts having to look at legislation as well in a way we haven't seen before. So it has been a year of flux, but I think the year to come will be much the same.
The transparency issue is much bigger than just the skullduggery at the bottom, because I in one of my most fantastically inaccurate stories about 6 months prior to sanctions being introduced, happily wrote an op-ed that shipping was finally stopping its opaque subterfuge nature and was suddenly becoming transparent because of carbon emissions, because of scale and access to finance. And I said confidently that shipping was about to become one of the most transparent industries in the world. How wrong I was. The point I'm making is that things change around us, and actually transparency is not necessarily a question of trying to avoid compliance. Sometimes it's a question of safety, and I want to come on to this because the point that Bridget made about AIS gaps is another point of transparency in terms of how much information, how much digital footprint does the shipping industry put out there. But Bridget, I mean, you've been tracking this on and off, and that AIS switch on, switch off thing is down to risk assessment, basically, isn't it now?
Yeah, so I think there's a pretty wide disconnect between what militaries and navies think and what the industry actually thinks.
That, of course, was Bridget Dyken from Lloyd's List.
I have to say as well, the AIS gaps are so inconsistent. We have ships that'll go through and they'll have the AIS on every voyage, and then one day they turn it off, and I don't know why. It's the other way around as well. So it's not clear to me that the industry is actually listening to what that guidance and advice is. And ultimately, it's true, it's down to risk appetite. So if the ships passing through are really confident that they're not going to get hit, then they don't think that there's any point to disable the AIS. And I suspect that the ones that are disabling AIS are the ones getting escorted by SPDs, and they aren't taking that advice at that time. And the others, like I said, I think sometimes it's, how am I feeling today? I don't always think it's a really, they think through it completely.
I ask all this as context because the question I really want to get to is the dark fleet getting darker, and what does that mean for us? And we talked briefly in the previous panel about the safety implications, but you've both mentioned that the various regimes are having an impact. They are forcing people to make decisions, and in most cases, they're probably not great decisions in terms of safety and insurability of these vessels. Do you think that these sanctions, are they forcing the dark fleet to get darker? Is that the ultimate consequence of what we're looking at here?
I would say yes, and I think there's a huge amount of resource and expertise in Russia to make this happen. And the reason for that is Putin needs to finance his war chest.
That was Michelle Lindemann from Van Baal and Bellis.
When sanctions were introduced in 22 and the West started freezing things and seizing assets, the West froze $300 billion worth of Russian central bank reserves. Now, that's a huge amount of money, but Putin apparently had $650 billion in his war chest. That buys a lot of weapons. And although obviously their resources have been depleted and are impacted, and we've got Russian oligarchs sanctioned around the world, all of their assets are mobilized as well. You've also got restrictions on loans into Russia, you've got restrictions on investment into Russia. So they don't have access to funds from the sort of places that they used to have. So where do they get their money from? It's got to come from their sales of oil. And there are people buying oil, and they are in India, and they're in China, and they're in Turkey. And the oil has to get from Russia to those places. And it can't get there with legitimate tankers and legitimate trade. It has to get there with the dark fleet. So that fleet will, in my view, continue to grow unless somebody comes up with a much better plan than the one we're using at the moment.
Daniel?
So I guess I would entirely agree with Michelle. There's a couple of things I would add. I don't think you necessarily need to rip up your transparency article just yet, because I would say it was more that pockets of the industry have become much more transparent and the bottom has become much less transparent. So I think if you think of sort of light spectrum, the dark fleet is getting darker, but there's more brightness at the top end and there's a greater contrast. So I think we will ask for information about beneficial ownership all the time in a way we wouldn't have asked 5 years ago and get it. Questions about why AIS was turned off, or voyage planning, or so those who are sort of doing that, I think the other point around the dark fleet is arguably the thing that is causing there are two reasons why the dark fleet exists. One, you have a valuable commodity, and there will always be those who will be willing to buy it, who are not subject to those jurisdictions. And I don't think you can ever reach a situation in which every nation imposes sanctions on a rogue state, if I can call it that. And that's what you'd have to do. You'd have to have a consistent position across the globe. And queries about what we do with sort of permanent members of the Security Council, and that's the reason there are no UN sanctions in place against Russia, is because of that. I think the other piece, of course, is that we have an oil price cap mechanism which is intended to allow the oil to continue to flow. And it would be, clearly we can't run the counterfactual, but if there was a complete prohibition on Russian oil being traded and carried, things might be different. So I think there are a number of it's quite easy to simplify, but I think, yes, I think for me the dark fleet is responding to a commercial opportunity. It is being enabled by reason of the restrictions that are in place, but there are those who are much more clear as to the level of risk they're willing to take and are insisting upon and receiving more information than ever before.
Let's talk hypotheticals, because I know that you can't make predictions here. But the point that I made in the last panel about what happens after January the 20th, we don't know. We don't know. We can guess that there will be an increase in focus on Iran from the US. What the Russian sanctions look like, we don't know. I guess the hypothetical question is, Donald Trump makes good on his promise and delivers a peace deal of some description. Does that just evaporate all sanctions? Do we pack up and go home? Do you start focusing on different aspects of law? Risk and compliance no longer a problem, presumably.
So if Mr. Trump does do a deal with Russia and the US pulls out, what happens then? Well, obviously the US is providing a huge amount of funds to Ukraine at the moment to help their war effort. Without that, what happens? Who is going to pay to support the Ukrainians? It will be left to the UK and the EU, and UK taxpayers, and EU taxpayers ultimately. The EU has had a bit of a plan that they are looking at, and they continue to talk about whether they might try and confiscate some of these assets that have been frozen and make, use those Russian state assets that have been frozen and use those to help support the Ukrainian war effort. So that's a possibility, but there's all sorts of legal hurdles to get through that, and certainly in the UK, we don't have any sort of mechanism really for forfeiture of those assets. Asset freezing, it does what it says, it freezes things. So lots of questions around how the Ukrainian war effort would be supported. Even when you look at Iran, when people were, I won't say we're friends with Iran, but when we had the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and there were some agreements that Iran was going to do certain things and the West started lifting sanctions, it still took a very long time to roll things back. Now, even if Mr. Trump does do a peace deal of some description, I can't imagine what that will look like. I can't imagine. But I don't think these things are lifted overnight. So I think that it will take some time for things to roll back. And, what will other nations do? I think there's been so much collaboration and will to work together. It's quite hard to imagine what's going to happen if Mr. Trump decides he's going to try and go off and do a deal. But I think others will, I'm sure, have views to add.
Well, I was going to say, Daniel, the phrase you used previously is we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle when it comes to risk and compliance. These requirements on due diligence, they're not suddenly going to evaporate just because the landscape changes politically, presumably.
If you look at the sort of narrow Russia issue, I'm certainly not an expert, but suggestions of some sort of ceasefire and a kind of demilitarized zone and things like that, you would think that those might, and Michelle's mentioned the JCP on Iran and sort of sanctions relief that was in place there, and whether we might see something like that, whether we might see a degree of sanctions relief offered as an incentive to agree to a deal, I don't know. But that level of complexity is not going to change. We will not see, as Michelle has said, all the sanctions lifted overnight. And for me, I think that sometimes the hardest challenge, I remember getting a call from a Singapore-based commodity trader on 16th of January 2016, when the Iran's first wave of sanctions were put in place, and they were saying, well, clearly Iran is open for business. Surely we can do everything. And for me, that period of time when sanctions relief is coming into play and things are beginning to become permitted is almost the most difficult and most dangerous time, because all of us as compliance professionals will be facing commercial pressure from within the organisation to do more in that jurisdiction. And therefore, what we'll see is sort of tapered relief of some kind. I think also, so open questions. We've all been so busy dealing with Russia-related issues, but there were issues before with Iran and Syria and North Korea and other jurisdictions, Venezuela, and I think there will still be a focus on those jurisdictions as well. So I certainly think, as you say, people have got used to having that information and correctly making information-based decisions, sort of reliant on risk appetite, and therefore wanting to have that information is not something that's going to go away.
And that is where we shall leave it for this episode. My thanks to everybody who participated in the Outlook Forum this year, but particularly thank you this week to Daniel and Michelle for joining the Lloyd's List Intelligence team for this debate. Thanks also to Lloyd's Register for sponsoring that event. Now, as I look at my calendar, it seems that we are getting dangerously close to Christmas and 2025. We don't like to think of you all alone out there with no podcast to keep you warm and company over the festive period. So we have been busy recording you a few festive highlights that we will run over the coming days and weeks. And then we will be back after a short break next year with another season of podcasts exploring the story shaping shipping. For now, though, my thanks to you for listening this year, and from the whole of the Lloyd's List Intelligence team, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.